Future value of place. One of the most interesting lessons I learned during my years as base architect at Tinker Air Force Base had very little to do with architecture itself. It involved a building that had already outlived its original purpose. When General Motors closed its Oklahoma City assembly plant, it left behind a massive industrial facility. Eventually, portions of that facility came into the possession of the United States Air Force, and during my time at Tinker, I was involved in overseeing maintenance, repairs, upgrades, and modifications necessary to adapt the facility for military use. The experience taught me something important about sustainability, adaptability, and the limits of architectural foresight. The building itself was in an interesting condition. The structural frame remained sound. The concrete floors and foundations were generally serviceable. The immense steel structure had been designed to support the unique operational requirements of an automotive assembly plant, where equipment, conveyors, and production systems were frequently suspended from overhead framing. The structure was extraordinarily robust because it had to be. At the same time, many of the building systems had reached the end of their useful lives. The roof leaked. Mechanical systems required extensive upgrades. Electrical systems needed replacement or modernization. Fire protection systems required significant work. Communications infrastructure had become obsolete. In many respects, General Motors had consumed the building systems while leaving behind a durable shell. The Air Force inherited that shell and invested substantial resources to make it suitable for a completely different mission. At first glance, this appears to be a story about adaptive reuse. A building designed for one purpose found a second life serving another. But the more I reflected on the experience, the less convinced I became that the building itself was the most important part of the story. The more important question was this: why did this building survive when so many others do not? The conventional answer is that it was a well-built structure. Certainly there is some truth in that. Strong structures tend to last longer than weak ones. But I believe something else was far more important. The building occupied valuable land within a complex metropolitan ecosystem. It was located within the Oklahoma City region. It was adjacent to major transportation corridors. It had access to utilities. It sat within an established industrial area. Most importantly, it existed near Tinker Air Force Base, one of the largest military installations in the nation. Nobody could have predicted that outcome when the plant was designed. The architects could not have predicted it. The engineers could not have predicted it. General Motors could not have predicted it. No one knew what Oklahoma City would look like 50 years later. No one knew whether the automobile industry would flourish or struggle. No one knew which military bases would expand and which would close. In fact, history provides a useful reminder of that uncertainty. Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio eventually closed. Had history unfolded differently and Tinker suffered a similar fate, the story of the former GM plant might have been very different. That realization leads to a lesson in humility. Architects, planners, and owners often talk about designing for the future. The reality is that we possess very little ability to predict the future beyond broad trends. We cannot know who will occupy a building 50 years from now. We cannot know which industries will thrive. We cannot know which technologies will emerge. We cannot know which institutions will survive. The best we can do is preserve options. This brings us to an aspect of sustainability that receives surprisingly little attention: land value. Most discussions of sustainable construction focus on materials, energy consumption, carbon emissions, recycling, and adaptability. These are important topics. But there is another question that deserves equal attention. If a building becomes obsolete, will the value of the land beneath it ever justify demolition? Demolition is expensive. Site restoration is expensive. Environmental remediation is often expensive. From a business perspective, demolition rarely creates value by itself. The economic justification usually comes from the future use of the land. If the underlying land is valuable, demolition becomes economically rational. If the land is not valuable, demolition often becomes difficult to justify. This reality has profound implications for the siting of large industrial facilities. Consider a massive industrial plant located within a growing metropolitan area. Even if the original use disappears, future opportunities may exist. The site might support another industrial user. It might become a distribution center, a research facility, a government installation, or some entirely new use that cannot yet be imagined. The land itself retains economic potential. Now consider a similar facility located in a rural area where land values remain low. The original owner departs. No replacement user appears. The demolition costs exceed the value of the cleared site. The result is predictable. The building remains. Not because anyone wants it, not because it serves a useful purpose. It remains because nobody can justify removing it. The structure becomes a stranded asset. Over time, it becomes a giant hulk of concrete and steel. This observation should not be interpreted as criticism of rural communities. Rural areas play a vital role in the economy and deserve investment and opportunity. The point is economic rather than social. The fewer potential future users that exist within a region, the fewer opportunities exist for adaptive reuse. Likewise, the lower the underlying land value, the weaker the economic incentive becomes to remove obsolete structures. These realities increase the probability that abandoned facilities will remain abandoned. Interestingly, the former GM plant offers another illustration of how difficult long-term prediction can be. When the facility operated as an automobile assembly plant, rail service was considered important. Rail corridors help support the movement of materials and products associated with automotive manufacturing. Years later, portions of that rail infrastructure no longer serve the same purpose. In some cases, the Air Force found greater value in the land occupied by rail facilities than in the rail facilities themselves. What one owner considered essential became expendable to another. Again, the lesson is humility. The future user may value entirely different things than the original owner. This is why I believe the story of the former GM plant is ultimately less about architecture than about planning. Architecture can influence adaptability. Planning can influence opportunity. Neither can guarantee success. The architects who designed the plant had legitimate reasons for creating a heavy structural system. Automotive manufacturing required it. The building could not have fulfilled its intended purpose without that robust framework. The steel structure was not an accident. It was not waste. It was the consequence of a specific industrial mission. Could the architects have designed a lighter building? Perhaps. But such a building might not have worked as an automotive plant. A building must first succeed at its intended purpose before it can succeed at any future purpose. This reality places limits on adaptability. The more specialized the function, the more specialized the building often becomes. No architect can completely eliminate that relationship. The lesson I ultimately draw from the former GM plant is not that we can predict the future. We cannot. It is not that every building can be made infinitely adaptable. It cannot. Nor is it that every obsolete structure can be economically removed. Many cannot. Instead, the lesson is that location may be the most important sustainability decision of all. Buildings located within diverse economic ecosystems possess more opportunities for a second life. Buildings located where land values remain strong possess greater prospects for redevelopment if adaptation fails. Buildings located where future users are numerous possess more paths forward than buildings located where alternatives are scarce. The future remains uncertain. That uncertainty cannot be designed away, but we can acknowledge it. And perhaps the most responsible course is not to pretend we know what the future holds, but to place major facilities where future generations will have the greatest number of choices. The former General Motors plant survived because history gave it those choices. Many buildings are not so fortunate.